There's something about being in the mountains during winter that sparks our imagination. Maybe it's the isolation, the rugged terrain, or the daunting snow-capped peaks that seem to touch the sky. Whatever the reason, there's no denying that ski trips have a way of getting under our skin and making us wonder about the unknown. We often associate winter wonderlands with feelings of joy, coziness, and togetherness. But what happens when that facade crumbles and we're left to face the darker side of these snowy landscapes? As we venture into the mountains, we're reminded that even in the most picturesque settings, fear and unease can lurk just beneath the surface. Imagine yourself surrounded by towering trees, the only sound being the crunch of snow beneath your boots. It's easy to feel a sense of vulnerability, isn't it? The mountains have a way of making us feel small and insignificant, and it's precisely this sense of powerlessness that can turn a fun-filled ski trip into a descent into terror. As we explore these unsettling experiences, we're forced to confront the darker aspects of human nature. It's a reminder that even in the most idyllic settings, the unknown can be just around the corner, waiting to pounce. I always thought ski trips were supposed to be fun days spent carving through fresh powder, nights sipping hot cocoa by the fire. But this trip was different. This trip wasn't about fun. It was about survival. It all started when my friends and I decided to spend a long weekend in a remote ski lodge up in the Rockies. It was a last-minute idea, one born from boredom and a group text filled with way too many exclamation points. The lodge was cheap, which should have been our first red flag. The listing boasted classic rustic charm and unbeatable mountain views, but the photos were blurry and the reviews were sparse. Still, we were desperate for an adventure, so we packed our gear and hit the road. The drive was uneventful until we reached the mountain pass. Snow began falling in thick, heavy flakes, quickly turning the road into a slippery mess. By the time we reached the lodge, visibility was near zero. The building loomed out of the storm like a ghost, its wooden facade dark and weathered, the windows glowing faintly. It looked nothing like the cozy retreat we'd imagined. "Are we sure this is the place?" Sarah asked, peering out from under her hood. "It's the address," Greg replied, his breath fogging in the icy air. "Come on, it'll be fine. We'll get a fire going, and it'll be just like the pictures." The interior wasn't much better. The furniture was old and mismatched. The floorboards creaked with every step, and a faint smell of mildew hung in the air, but it was warm. And after unpacking and lighting a fire, the place started to feel almost cozy. Almost. It wasn't until later that night, after we'd eaten and settled in, that things started to feel off. The first sign was the sound. A low, distant rumble like thunder, but it didn't stop. It just went on and on, a deep vibration that seemed to come from the very bones of the lodge. "Probably just the wind," Greg said when I brought it up, but it didn't sound like wind. The second sign was the footsteps. They started around midnight, soft but distinct, like someone pacing just outside the cabin. At first I thought it was one of my friends, but when I peeked out the window, all I saw was snow and darkness. "Did anyone go outside?" I asked when I returned to the living room. Everyone shook their heads. "You're imagining things," Sarah said, but her voice wavered. By the next morning, the storm had worsened. Thick drifts of snow blocked the doors, and the windows were frosted over. We were effectively trapped. Greg tried to make light of the situation, joking about snowed in horror movies, but no one laughed. That's when we found the journal. It was tucked in a drawer in one of the bedrooms, a leather-bound book with yellowed pages and an old-fashioned clasp. Curious, I opened it. The entries were dated decades ago and written in a neat, cramped script. At first, it seemed like the diary of someone who had once stayed in the lodge, detailing mundane things like the weather and meals. But as I read on, the tone shifted. January 12th, heard something last night. Thought it was the wind, but it didn't sound right. Like voices. Low and whispering. January 14th, found tracks in the snow around the lodge. Too big for an animal, too misshapen for a person. No one's supposed to be up here. January 16th, it's inside. I can hear it moving at night. The others don't believe me, but they will. They will. The entries ended abruptly, the final page torn out. I showed the journal to the others, but Greg just laughed it off. "It's probably some prank," he said, "or some writer trying to scare their friends." But that night, the footsteps came back. Louder this time, closer. I barely slept, every creak and groan of the lodge setting my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard a door slam. I got up to check, but all the doors were shut tight. When I looked out the window, I saw something that froze the blood in my veins. Tracks. Deep, heavy tracks in the fresh snow, leading from the woods to the lodge and back again. They were huge, easily twice the size of my boot, and oddly shaped, with what looked like long, clawed toes. "Wake up," I hissed, shaking Sarah and Greg awake. "You need to see this." They followed me to the window, their faces pale as they took in the tracks. "Okay," Greg said finally. "Maybe there's a bear? A really big bear? In the middle of a blizzard?" Sarah snapped. "And bears don't have feet like that." We decided to stick together for the rest of the night, huddled in the living room with every light on. But the lights didn't make us feel safer. If anything, they made the shadows seem darker. The storm raged on, and by morning the tracks were gone, covered by fresh snow. But the unease remained. We spent the day trying to distract ourselves, playing cards and telling stories, but the tension was palpable. None of us dared mention the journal or the tracks, but I could see it in their eyes. We were all thinking the same thing. We weren't alone. That night, the lodge felt colder than before, the fire unable to chase away the chill. The footsteps returned, louder and more deliberate, pacing back and forth just outside the door. Then came the scratching, long, slow scrapes against the wood, like claws testing the strength of the walls. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Stay quiet," Greg said. "Maybe it'll go away." But it didn't go away. The scratching grew more frantic, and then there was a loud bang, like something heavy throwing itself against the door. We backed away, huddling together as the banging continued. "It's going to get in," Sarah sobbed. "What do we do?" "The basement," I said. "We can hide in the basement." We grabbed the journal and our flashlights and made our way to the basement door. The stairs creaked loudly under our weight, and the air grew colder the deeper we went. The basement was damp and dark, filled with old furniture and crates. We found a corner and huddled together, our flashlights the only source of light. Upstairs, the banging grew louder, and then came the sound of splintering wood. It was inside. We sat in terrified silence, listening as it moved through the lodge. Heavy footsteps thudded across the floor above us, slow and deliberate. It was searching for us. "What is it?" Sarah whispered. "I don't know," I replied, clutching the journal like a talisman. The footsteps stopped directly above us. Then came the sound of creaking floorboards, as if it was pressing its weight down, testing the strength of the wood. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the basement as something heavy fell through the ceiling. A figure loomed in the faint beam of our flashlights, its form grotesque and unnatural. Pale skin stretched over jagged bones, eyes sunken and black, and a mouth that opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It let out a guttural, inhuman growl, and we screamed. Greg grabbed a broken chair leg and swung it at the creature, but it barely flinched. It lunged at him, claws swiping, and Greg went down with a scream. Sarah and I bolted for the stairs, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we ran. We burst out into the storm, the cold air hitting us like a wall. Snow swirled around us, and the lodge's dark silhouette loomed behind. We ran, not knowing where we were going, only that we had to get away. When we finally stopped, panting and shivering, the lodge was out of sight. Sarah clutched my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we weren't going back. We stumbled upon a ranger station hours later, half frozen and incoherent. They didn't believe our story, chalking it up to exhaustion and hypothermia. But the lodge was abandoned. The storm had covered any tracks, and Greg was never found. To this day, I can't look at snow without hearing those footsteps, without feeling the chill of that thing's gaze. I don't know what it was, but I know one thing. It's still out there, waiting for its next visitors. I always loved the mountains in winter, the snow-blanketed peaks, the sharp, clean air, the promise of speed as you carved down the slopes. This year's trip to the Aspenwood Lodge was supposed to be the highlight of the season. The ski resort had just reopened after several years of renovations, boasting state-of-the-art facilities and untouched powder trails. For an avid skier like me, it was paradise. The first 2 days were perfect. The runs were pristine, the weather crisp but not biting, and the lodge's rustic charm made for the perfect retreat after hours on the slopes. But on the third day, everything changed. It started with a whisper, or at least that's what it felt like. Standing in line for the chairlift, I thought I heard someone call my name. Turning around, I found nothing but the cheerful chaos of skiers and snowboarders shuffling forward. "Must be the wind," I muttered to myself and shook it off. The chairlift operator, a gaunt man with a cigarette hanging from his lips, barely glanced at me as I climbed onto the seat. The lift jerked to life, pulling me and my board into the air. I loved the ride up. It was peaceful, suspended between the earth and sky, the trees below shrinking into a frosty maze. But that day, the quiet felt different, oppressive. The farther I ascended, the more the landscape seemed to stretch into an infinite expanse of white. Even the lodge below disappeared, swallowed by the distance. I tried to focus on the view, but unease prickled at the back of my neck. Halfway up the mountain, the chairlift shuddered and stopped. I glanced down at the support tower, expecting to see maintenance workers or some kind of commotion. Nothing, just silence and the creak of the lift swaying in the wind. Not unusual, I told myself. I'd been skiing long enough to know chairlifts stalled all the time. But as the minutes ticked by, my anxiety grew. I checked my phone. No signal. Just as I was about to shout for help, a voice floated through the air, soft and clear. "You shouldn't be here." I froze. The words were faint, almost carried away by the wind, but they were unmistakable. My breath fogged in the frigid air as I whipped my head around, searching for the source. There was no one else on the lift. The chairs ahead and behind me swung empty. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, only the low moan of the wind. My hands gripped the safety bar, knuckles white against my gloves. I felt exposed, like the vast whiteness around me was watching, waiting. The lift jolted suddenly, the motion nearly unseating me. I clung to the bar, heart pounding as it creaked back to life. But something was wrong. The chair wasn't heading toward the peak. Instead, it veered left, pulling me along a line that wasn't on any of the resort maps. I shouted for help, waving frantically at the empty slopes below, but no one appeared. The trees thickened as the lift carried me deeper into unmarked terrain. Panic clawed at my chest. I wanted to jump, but the drop was too far, the snow below too sparse to cushion the fall. "You shouldn't be here." The voice came again, louder this time, closer. I whipped my head around. There, sitting on the chair behind me, was a figure. Its face was obscured by a tattered ski mask. but its eyes burned through the fabric, twin pinpricks of icy blue that made my stomach churn. I hadn't seen anyone get on behind me. I was sure of it. "What do you want?" I yelled, my voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. It just stared, unblinking as the lift carried us higher into the trees. I tried to focus on my breathing, on anything other than the icy gaze drilling into my back. The lift slowed again, then stopped. We were suspended above a clearing, the snow below untouched and eerily pristine. The figure rose, its movements slow and deliberate, and climbed onto the safety bar. "Stop!" I shouted, but it leaped effortlessly into the snow, landing without a sound. The figure's head tilted up, meeting my gaze. Then it turned and began walking toward the trees, its footsteps vanishing as quickly as they appeared in the powder. I sat frozen, paralyzed by indecision. Part of me wanted to stay on the lift, to pray it would start moving again and carry me back to safety. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't follow, I'd never understand what was happening. Against every instinct, I unhooked my board, took a deep breath, and jumped. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but I scrambled to my feet and clipped into my bindings. The figure was already disappearing into the tree line. "Wait!" I called, chasing after it. The trees closed in around me, their skeletal branches clawing at my jacket. The snow muffled everything, even the sound of my board gliding over it. I lost sight of the figure but kept moving, drawn forward by some inexplicable pull. The forest grew darker, the air heavier, until I stumbled into another clearing. At the center stood a cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of decades of snow. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar, revealing only shadow within. My breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as I stepped closer. Something about the cabin felt wrong, as if the very ground it stood on was tainted. The voice came again, but this time it was different. Multiple voices, overlapping, echoing, rising from the cabin's depths. They weren't words, not exactly, but sounds that clawed at my sanity. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. The door creaked open wider, revealing a figure standing just inside. It was the same one from the lift, its icy eyes glowing in the darkness. But now, its mask was gone. The face beneath was a nightmare of twisted flesh, its features warped as though it had been melted and reshaped by cruel hands. Its mouth stretched into a jagged grin as it raised a hand and beckoned me forward. I stumbled back, my board catching on a root, and fell hard onto the snow. The figure stepped out of the cabin, moving with unnatural speed. Its grin widened, revealing rows of blackened, broken teeth. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline surging, and bolted back the way I came. The forest seemed alive, the trees closing ranks to block my path. Branches clawed at my face, the snow thickening around my legs. Behind me, the whispers grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of footsteps gaining on me. I didn't dare look back. Bursting out of the tree line, I nearly collapsed in relief as I spotted the resort lights flickering in the distance. I pushed myself harder, legs burning, until I reached the edge of the main slope. Scare zipped past, oblivious to my panic. I stumbled into the lodge, collapsing onto the floor, gasping for breath. The staff looked at me like I was crazy when I tried to explain what had happened. The chairlift operator swore up and down that the lift had never stopped, that it had followed its usual route all day. No one believed me. No one had seen the figure or the cabin. But I know what I saw. And I know it's still out there, waiting in the trees for the next skier foolish enough to follow its call. We had been looking forward to the trip for months. 8 of us friends since college, packed into 2 cars and headed to Snow Creek Resort. It wasn't the most glamorous destination, but it promised excellent slopes and a rustic cabin nestled in the heart of the forest, perfect for our annual getaway. The first day was everything we'd hoped for. Clear skies, fresh powder, and hours spent laughing as we raced down the trails. By the time the sun dipped below the mountains, we were exhausted but exhilarated. That night, we gathered around the cabin's fireplace, swapping stories and making plans for the next day. None of us could have predicted how quickly things would change. It started with the storm. The weather report had mentioned a chance of snow, but this was something else entirely. By morning, the windows were crusted with frost, and the world outside had disappeared behind a curtain of white. The snow was relentless, piling up against the cabin until it felt like we were trapped in a buried tomb. "Looks like we're snowed in," Alex said, peering out a sliver of cleared window. His tone was light, but the tension in the room was palpable. Our phones had no service and the landline was dead. We had enough food and firewood for a couple of days, but the idea of being completely cut off from civilization was unsettling. "Guess we're making the most of cabin life," Lily suggested, trying to sound cheerful. We played cards, drank too much, and told ghost stories to pass the time, but as the hours dragged on, the storm seemed to press in on us, a weight that grew heavier with each passing minute. By the second night, the mood had shifted. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and an unease had settled over the group. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't as alone as we thought. It was Ben who first noticed the tracks. He had ventured outside early in the morning to check the generator, bundled in layers against the bitter cold. When he came back, his face was pale, and he was trembling and not from the cold. Someone's out there," he stammered. "I saw tracks in the snow. Huge tracks." "Maybe an animal?" Rachel suggested, though her voice wavered. Ben shook his head. "They weren't animal tracks. They were barefoot. Human." A silence fell over the room, heavy and suffocating. We exchanged uneasy glances, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Who would be out here in the middle of a blizzard, barefoot? "You sure you didn't imagine it?" Alex asked, but even he didn't sound convinced. Ben's eyes were wild. "I know what I saw." They led right up to the cabin and stopped, like someone was standing outside, watching. We tried to dismiss it as a trick of the storm, but none of us ventured outside that day. The hours crawled by, the howling wind a constant reminder of our isolation. By nightfall, the cabin felt colder, the fire struggling to chase away the chill that seemed to seep from the very walls. That night, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it got out of a dream, a faint scratching that barely registered in my half-asleep state. But then it came again, louder this time, unmistakably real. Something was scraping against the door. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear over the storm. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, followed by a low, guttural noise that sent a shiver down my spine. I thought about waking the others, but fear rooted me in place. Instead, I crept to the window and wiped away the frost. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood just beyond the porch, barely visible in the swirling snow. It was tall and gaunt, its skin as pale as the surrounding drifts. Its head tilted unnaturally, and its eyes were black pits, empty and endless. As I watched, it raised a hand thin and clawed and dragged its fingers slowly down the wooden door, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring at the door. I don't remember how long I stayed frozen, but eventually the scratching stopped. When I dared to look again, it was gone. The next morning, I told the others what I'd seen. They listened in stunned silence, their faces pale. Ben didn't say, "I told you so," but he didn't have to. We all felt it, the presence, the malevolence that seemed to cling to the air. "We need to leave," Lily said, her voice trembling. "Storm or not, we can't stay here." But leaving wasn't an option. The snow was too deep, the roads impassable. We were trapped. By nightfall, the unease had turned to outright fear. We barricaded the doors and windows as best we could, but it didn't feel like enough. The hours dragged on, and just as we thought we might survive the night, the noises started again. It wasn't just scratching this time. There were footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling the cabin, the sound of something being dragged through the snow. And then the whispers, low and guttural, in a language none of us recognized. "Stay together," Alex said, his voice shaking. "Don't split up." The whispers grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were coming from inside the cabin. The fire sputtered and died, plunging us into darkness. Someone screamed, and then all hell broke loose. The figure was inside. It moved like a shadow, impossibly fast, its black eyes glinting in the dim light of our flashlights. It lunged at Ben, and he went down with a strangled cry. The rest of us scattered, running blindly through the cabin. I ended up in the kitchen, clutching a knife with shaking hands. The whispers were everywhere, filling my head, drowning out my thoughts. I don't know how long I stayed there, paralyzed by fear, but eventually the noises stopped. The silence was worse. When I finally emerged, the cabin was empty. My friends were gone. The only sign of them was the front door, wide open, snow blowing in to cover the floor. I stepped outside, the cold biting through my clothes, and saw the tracks leading away from the cabin. barefoot, human. I don't remember how I made it out. I wandered through the storm for what felt like hours before collapsing near a ranger station. They found me the next morning, half frozen and incoherent. I tried to tell them what happened, but they didn't believe me. They never found the cabin, or my friends. To this day, I can still hear the whispers when it snows. Low and guttural, just beyond the edge of hearing. I've stopped trying to convince myself it was all in my head. I know better now. Some places are meant to be left alone.